So I'd like to just give you a case study in accelerated approval and what we've learned from it and how it has helped our community. Duchenne muscular dystrophy is an X-linked progressive debilitating disease. It's one of the largest genes in the human genome and also one of the largest protein products. So we can talk about 2,000 mutations across this gene and hotspots within the gene, but that in no way describes what it's like to have Duchenne muscular dystrophy and for a family to have a young man with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. When we think about progressive loss of function, we're talking about a boy who is born looking quite normal, although might miss his milestones slightly, usually improves in terms of refining small and large motor function in the early years between 4 and 7, but by about 8 years old, they're at their peak performance. And so by what we see about age 12 is the loss of the ability to walk. By age 15, the loss of arm function. By age 15, also the need for non-invasive ventilation, especially at night while sleeping. The disease is 100% fatal, and the mean age of death is 30. Next slide, please. So while we see in Duchenne muscular dystrophy a 30-year progression, what we're also seeing is by the age of 15, most of these young men no longer walk and can no longer lift their hands to their mouth. So this is a slowly progressive disease, and we are thrilled and excited for the SMA community with the approval of Zolgensma and other indications for SMA. And in Zolgensma, if we look at SMA1, those little babies are born really without function, and they lose their life by about 48 months. So when we see, or 24 to 48 months. So what we see here with Zolgensma is a Lazarus effect. Those little children who weren't expected to roll over or sit up or speak are doing exactly that. They're rolling over, they're sitting up, some are walking, and they're speaking. So it is an incredible Lazarus effect to what we see, and we're thrilled for the SMA community. However, in a disease like Duchenne, where it's slowly progressive, we don't have expectations of a Lazarus effect. We have none of those. When we think about how to run trials in a slowly progressive disease, it's hard to look at a clinical endpoint because regardless of what population you choose, whether an ambulatory population or using arm function as an endpoint, it's still very slowly progressing. So we'd have to have trials that exist way beyond 12 or 18 months to really understand the full effect of a drug. So accelerated approval, as described earlier by Frank and GK and Dr. Unger, it's reasonably likely. So that means there's a real chance of something providing benefit to this population, and reasonably likely. And if we can look at Dr. Unger's presentation of 70% chance of rain, I'd carry an umbrella. And in this case, accelerated approval really gives us the chance to look at something that is good, perhaps not perfect, but is reasonably good and reasonably likely to show benefit. Next slide, please. So in slowly progressive diseases, what we see as benefit, or what we describe as benefit, we look at it in 3 flavors, essentially. Improvement, but that's what we're all hoping for. But when function is lost, when muscle in our case is gone, you cannot restore muscle, you can't rebuild it. So reversal is usually impossible in our disease, unless there are other technologies somewhere in the future that enable that. But what we're looking for is slower progression. If we can have more time, if these young men can, and some women can have more time walking, if they can have more time lifting their arm to their mouth, more time breathing, then that closes that gap on what we see as the mean age of death of 30, but the average person at the age of 15 or 16 does not have the ability to lift hand to mouth. So if you could improve that quality into the 20s, it would be amazing. Not a Lazarus effect, but certainly for those who are diagnosed with Duchenne and their families would be incredible. And I think one of the things that we forget about is stability as benefit. In a disease where you're anticipating decline, when you have stability, preservation of function is really, really necessary and important, and surely means of benefit. I don't think there's a parent or an individual diagnosed with Duchenne who doesn't go to bed every night and wish and pray to whoever they believe in that nothing further, no other muscle cell dies. Next slide, please. So when we think about what is a loss of function to the individual, and I venture to say, as we look at SMA1, and that's a Lazarus effect, I think we also have to sort of reset ourselves to look at rare progressive diseases and each of these loss of functions as a little death. We have to, and I know that doesn't compare to death itself, but in terms of the individual's loss of function, that does feel like a death to them. Loss of the ability to stand from a seating position means that you can't get up off your chair in school at all. So if there's a fire, someone's going to have to get you off that chair and get you out of the school. The loss of the ability to stand on one foot. Now, I think every parent would say, maybe it doesn't even matter, but it does, because this is a clear indication of core strength. If you have core strength, then you're less likely to be knocked over in school and fall on the ground and perhaps at risk for a fracture. The loss of ambulation, what does that mean for this individual? It means that he's going to be using a wheelchair to do everything in terms of his movement. I will agree that it gives them more freedom because the risk of falling earlier, but still means, can they get into friends' homes? Can they get into buildings that are not accessible? Can they go up curves that are not accessible? Depends on the city you live in. And a loss of arm function, again, another little death, being unable to lift your hand to your mouth, to have dinner with friends. You'll need to be fed. It means that you can't comb your hair. It means that you don't have privacy. Someone is going to have to help you for all of those activities. And the need for non-invasive ventilation, this means that you're not breathing it well at night and perhaps during the day, depending on your forced vital capacity and your breathing apparatus. But using ventilation means that that piece of equipment then is strapped onto the wheelchair. Again, it limits this person's ability to have access to all the things he or she wishes to do. Next slide. And what do these little deaths mean on a family when there's a loss of function? When there's a loss of the ability to stand from sitting, this means that someone has to help them get off, lift them and get off that couch or the chair or whatever. Loss of the ability to stand on one foot. We really worry about these young men falling and fracturing can have a ripple effect of other problems along the way, such as fatty embolism and others that can cause death or hospitalization for sure. Loss of ambulation not only means this person isn't walking, they're using a wheelchair. You're going to have to travel with that wheelchair, so that expense to the family of buying a wheelchair van so that you can accommodate that. So it has this long ripple effect. Loss of arm function again. That means your family or some caregiver has to provide that help for you to comb your hair, to go to the bathroom, to have some privacy, and to feed yourself. And I think one of the things that we have to think about is by the age of 15, most of these young men are going to need a primary caregiver or help, whether that's a family member or whether that's someone brought into the house, for every single activity of daily living. That has an extreme effect on families, on their ability to survive together, to thrive together, on the financial requirements, on some of the employment, because often you're going to have someone caring. So many times parents or caregivers will stop working so that they can take care of this young man who has these needs. Next slide, please. And what is the ripple effect on the field when we get a accelerated approval? It's quite incredible what we have seen. And Frank mentioned the 4 approvals that we had, and perhaps the approval that was controversial, the first approval. But I will say that approval leads to a recognition that there's proof of concept here, that this particular approach is going to work, is useful, it makes sense. So that leads to more research, industry competition, more trials, and more approvals. So there is a ripple effect on the field. It also says, when my sons were diagnosed, the physician said to me, there's no hope and no help, and there'll never be a treatment. Accelerated approval says, this works. Here's proof of concept. We know enough about this pathology to be able to target different pathways and slow or halt progression. Music to my ears. So I think the improvement or the ripple effect on a field with an accelerated approval is remarkable. Right now, today in Duchenne muscular dystrophy, if we look at when Chris and Pat were here, my 2 sons, there were no industry sponsors interested in this space. Fast forward to today, we have about 46 active trials. We have about 6 companies looking at gene therapy. We have many more companies looking at the mRNA approach in terms of exon skipping or antisense oligonucleotides. And then Companies coming in and saying, well, is that heart built to last, which has been our question for a long time. Can we really improve heart function so that if these young men are walking into 30 and hopefully 50 as the lifespan increases, then we are protecting their function and enabling them to have full lives full of function and not worry that they'll fall and fracture. Next slide, please. So what does reasonably likely mean? It means opportunity. It means opportunity to participate in trials, but also to have the opportunity to look at this drug in the context of their life and see what value it has. It means equity. Not everyone can join clinical trials. They might not fit the inclusion criteria. They may not be able to travel there. They may live in a small community and the clinical trial site is far distant from them. So leaving their home and their comfort of home and their trusted environment of healthcare professionals to go to a clinical site at some distance with people they don't know, with a team they're not familiar with, and not the trust that's been established to join a clinical trial, that may not work. So not everyone can join clinical trials. Not everyone has a support system at home to participate. Not everyone has an employer that says, sure, take the time off, however long that takes to participate in a trial. Not every young man wants to leave his school and his regimen that he's used to at home, or all of the things that are in place in his life at his home. Not everyone has the ability to participate in trials. It means access. It means an access for everyone wherever they live once we get an accelerated approval. It hopefully means preservation of function. And it's about time. Time is the commodity here because we already know the trajectory of this disease really very well. We have multiple natural history studies. The doctors predict it at the day of diagnosis. They tell you what's going to happen at what point. Now we are even more specific about prediction. If the forced vital capacity is this, you're going to need non-invasive ventilation. Then if your walking looks like this, in terms of the gait analysis, we can predict you're going to lose function and lose the ability to walk. So we can really predict what you're going to lose within what period of time. So reasonably likely to me means that we save time. Accelerated approval means that we save time and lives and function. And I think it's essential in rare disease that we are able to utilize this pathway. I agree. I think Frank has said multiple times that I've heard him say is that the first drug does not need to be perfect to be a watershed moment. It's a glimmer of brighter days ahead and indeed spurs innovation and acceleration of therapy development. Next slide, please. So accelerated approval. Patients want safe and effective drugs. I've heard it said long ago, patients will accept anything. I disagree. Patients want safe and effective drugs. What they want is to have the experience to utilize those drugs to see the full effect of both their safety and efficacy. Accelerated approval is a pathway that enables real world evidence. How does this child look? And we're talking, and forgive me for all the men online, when we're looking at little 5-year-old boys, they're not so good with these outcome measures. They're distracted, they don't get it, they don't really want to do it, and why should they? So this gives us a real world evidence to ask the question, is this drug safe and does it help? Does it preserve function? Does it delay the onset of loss of function? In slowly progressive diseases, this is critical because we can't do trials and no company will be willing to do a trial for 3 years. And frankly, the rare disease community doesn't want 3-year trials. We need these drugs to get out in the environment so that there isn't just a small subset of people with a single outcome measure or primary outcome measure. We need to have an experience, given the variability of this disease, is what does benefit to look like to you, the individual with this disease? And can we match that up against our natural history and say, you're walking in this gait at this rate, and therefore you won't lose function, or it's unlikely that you'll lose function for 5 more years, which would be music to our ears. This provides access to people who wait and often wait their lifetime. My son Patrick once at 8 years old went to a high school. He was at a Catholic high school and he was asked to participate in an auction, and he was going to buy the ability to be the coach at a basketball game. He asked me for a blank check, and I said, "Oh my gosh, a blank check, Patrick? What are you really looking for?" And he said, "It's my midlife crisis," and indeed it was. He died at the age of 15. Accelerated approval in rare diseases is the way forward. It is about time, which is the commodity in rare diseases. It's about slowing progression or halting progression, because indeed that is benefit, and that's what we're looking for. Thank you again.